Hi, this is Melissa Rondo, true crime therapist. And here today, I'm with Jeff Rinek, retired FBI agent. Jeff, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
So Jeff has written a book, In the Name of the Children, an FBI agent's relentless pursuit of the nation's worst predators. Jeff, this was my favorite book that I've written.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And it's because you not only did you give examples of cases that you worked on,
Hmm.
and you talked about the impact on families and victims, but you got really personal, also talked about the impact on you and your family.
Right.
So that's why the book really meant a lot to me as a therapist. Can you tell listeners who don't know who you are, can you talk a little bit about what you did with the FBI and who you are?
Sure. Well, I'm me. I'm Jeffrey Rinek, and I was born and raised in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I went to school to Cheltenham High School, which is in the suburbs. I went to college at Albright, which is in Reading, Pennsylvania. And I had always wanted to be an FBI agent since I was 10 years old. Never really thinking I had the chance for it, but nevertheless, when I graduated college, I applied to the FBI and I was offered to be a what they call a support employee, a clerk. Uh, and hang on one second. Off. I was offered the opportunity to be a support employee, which really is not as good as it sounds because you're basically a clerk. And when I joined the FBI in 1976, the FBI, it was all being a clerk was being a clerk. You handled paper, whatever. And so I spent 2.5 years as a clerk or support employee. And then I went back to school at night and got the equivalent of a second undergraduate degree, which qualified me to apply as an FBI agent accountant. And the FBI gave a special accounting test made up by the AICPA. And if you passed that, then you were eligible to be considered for agents class. And that's how I got into being an agent. I went to agents class in June of '78, and my first office was Chicago, where I served for like 2 years. And then my dad was um, diagnosed with cancer in the spring of 1979, or yeah, and he had his prognosis was 2 years. He had lung cancer. My dad was a smoker, and I wanted to be with him, so I volunteered to go to the New York office, and I spent the next 11 years in New York, working out of 26 Federal Plaza in Manhattan. And it was here that I met Lori, who would be the biggest change and development in my life. And we ended up getting married in 1984. We agreed that we didn't want to bring our children up in the on the I the number one corridor, in the New York area. It was so congested, and for me, Lori and I bought an old farmhouse that we refurbished. It was like
Nice.
150 years old when we bought it, and my commute to and from work was 2.5 hours each way. And there's no way I could live my life like that. And Lori understood, and we agreed to move to a city that would be best to bring up a family. And Lori was a research biologist at Merck and Company, had her master's in human physiology, so she's a lot smarter than me, and she made more money than me. So she took the lead in finding us a city to consider. And we ended up coming to Sacramento. Ironically, we never got to see Sacramento before we moved here. Our oldest son became very ill when he was 3.5, and because of his illness, he wasn't able to travel with us. to go see different cities. And so we accepted the transfer to Sacramento. And then in April of 1991, we moved out here, and I was in Sacramento ever since. I in Chicago and New York, I had worked white collar crime. I had also done a stint on violent crime, but I was never really. I was my focus in life was Lori, um, and it was the first time in my life I really had a focus on what I wanted, and what I wanted was to be with Lori and in our house in our own little world and start our family. Unfortunately, in 1990, our oldest son Joe got sick. He had a disease called pediatric nephrotic syndrome, and it was very serious. And because of that, Lori and I went through, it was a big emotional upheaval. Lori was emotionally stronger than I was in dealing with it. And we actually had to deal with it while we were transferring out to Sacramento. During our trip to come to Sacramento, we actually had to stop off in Omaha and spent a week at the University of Nebraska in Omaha because they had to hospitalize him and try and get him well enough to travel again. So it was a difficult time. And then we got out here to Sacramento, and about a year after I got out here, Joe started doing better. Lori once again handled the brunt of it because she had to take Joe to all of his appointments and all of the things, and I was going to work every day. And then about a year in, uh, we experienced a child abduction of a 7-month-old baby here in South Sacramento, and I was sent down to make contact with the Sacramento Police Department. And that was the beginning of my new career, I'll call it, working the violent crime against children. And because of what we had been through with Joe, it had caused me to develop this obsession. I wouldn't say obsession, but dedication. To tell you, in my mind, the thought of a child suffering in the arms or hands of a stranger was unbearable. And I believe it happened because when we saw our son in the hospital, and then we saw the other kids in the hospital, and then when this kid was abducted, and we realized, who's got him? What are they doing with them? So I
Yeah,
I ended up working closely with the Sacramento Police Department. Our squad in the FBI office did, and I got to be really good friends with the detective that was in charge of the case. His name was Greg Stewart, and about 4 days after he was abducted, we recovered him alive. And it was a very dramatic moment. We made a tactical entry into the apartment he was being kept at, and we didn't even know it was him. We had to pass him around, and everybody was looking at him, and we determined it was him. And then we just simply took him in the unmarked FBI car down to the emergency room at UC Davis where he was treated, and it was happily ever after. In fact, he was taken from an area in South Sacramento that was considered to be fairly dangerous with gangs and narcotics. And about a week after we got him back, the neighborhood invited the FBI and Sacramento Police Department down for a block party to celebrate
that's
his
great.
return. So that was the beginning of it. My supervisor at the time was a guy named Don Pierce, and he saw something in me because I started being assigned all of the cases that involved children. And during this time, also, the director of the FBI was Louis Free, who was very dedicated and created initiatives for the FBI to lend our resources and get involved in cases involving violent crime against children. And so I got sort of swept up in that. And Lori says I suffered a successful career, and it's right. I mean, it's hard to explain. Um, you know, to be successful was great, but to experience the crime scenes and the events of what happened to these children was unbearable. And um, the way for me is, if I was at a crime scene or working these cases, when I was there and working them, I was without emotion. And then once it was over and I'd come home, Lori would be there and I would just sort of let it all out.
Yeah.
It started changing me. I didn't realize in the beginning. I started becoming distant from the family. I had trouble concentrating on things. I would sit in front of a TV, not even knowing what was on. Um, I remember one time we were eating dinner. We're really lucky. We live in a home on a hill facing the Sierra Nevada. We have a beautiful view, and Lori always wanted us to eat outside, and and I remember sitting out there one night eating and uh, not realizing that they were talking to me. I was just kind of sitting there in blank. Um, and as time came on, I didn't really realize it. The first thing that happened was a friend of mine in the office who had suffered a tragedy arranged for me to meet with the chaplain, and the chaplain explained to me that I was following escapist behavior because with my son Joe, because when I would come home from work, I would head right out to the garage and putz around, do my thing. And he explained to me, that I need to be there to help the family, to help Lori, and I wasn't doing that. And when I realized it, I didn't feel really good about myself, but I resolved that I would not do that. And sort of the same thing was happening with the cases in that they were affecting me, and I wasn't really either I wasn't strong enough to face it or whatever. But eventually, and Lori and I have talked about it quite a bit. Um, Eventually, the emotional impact of the cases for me became so great that it affected my physical health, and I ended up I had a knee replacement surgery, and I developed a staph infection, and the staph infection knocked out my pituitary gland, and I had no cortisol, which is fight or flight
Right.
hormones, and I had no more testosterone, which meant, I wasn't really acting the way I should. And so these were things that really affected me and caused me to be a burden to my own family. Um, Lori and I talk now because she believes that it was the loss of the hormones that caused my behavior, and she's right. But I still remember the thoughts and feelings and how I felt then. So, it's hard for me to accept that totally. But she's always right with the other stuff.
Right. When you were experiencing some of these symptoms, was there a certain case that you worked or a certain point where you started to notice it was becoming more frequent? I know in the book, um, you had said, I have learned that PTSD and vicarious or secondary trauma are real phenomena and affect not just those in combat, but also those waging the war at home, from first responders of all types, therapists, which I appreciate you mentioned that, social workers, emergency room doctors, and many people in law enforcement. So I was curious, did you have a certain point where you thought to yourself, I have PTSD?
When the loss of my hormones was discovered and I started with hormone therapy to try and bring me back, I started accepting the reality that I did have PTSD from what I'd seen. I knew that things with me weren't right. Um, my mind thinks in videos. I don't. I guess I would never presume to know that I know how other people think, but in my mind. So what was happening with me is that the videos were of the crime scenes playing over and over in my head. And one example that Lori noticed that I wasn't made aware of till after I was doing better was that in the book, I wrote about the book, the chapter concerning
Mhm.
Michael Lyons. And when we were at his crime scene, Michael was wearing a Batman t-shirt. And all the things associated with that were constantly, going through my mind over and over. It was like a loop. And I didn't know it till after I retired, but Lori had gone through the house and removed all the Batman t-shirts, anything with Batman on it. And it's as recent as I have a grandson who's 7 years old, and I think it was 2 years ago or a year ago that he was over visiting, and he had tape on his boots, and Lori had his mother tape up the Batman on his boots.
Mm.
As I say it now, I can feel myself going, but when I realized then I was mad at myself for having put them in that way in the first place. And then, you always wonder, is it ever going to get better? And um, I can tell you with no hesitation or reservation that the only reason I'm alive today is Lori. I live every day to be with her. And as long as I'm with her, I'm okay. If I'm not, I'm not okay. Um, so I don't know if that provides any explanation.
Yeah, it does. So yeah, so you're saying like even if you're away from her and then you can feel yourself slipping, dissociating, going
Right.
back to intrusive thoughts maybe.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
I think we all constantly think back on our lives and what we've done and what we've lived through and experienced and things like that. Here in Sacramento, and I wouldn't presume to speak for others, but I do believe it does apply. I'm a recluse now. I don't go out. Every place I go, I associate who died there or what I did there. And that starts the loops of the videos. So I live pretty much at home. I love where we live. I love putzing around the house and working on cars, and I'm content doing that. And so if I can wake up with Lori and spend the day at the house and do our thing and be with Lori, I'm good. If I'm away from Lori and I'm somewhere else, um, I don't do that well. In fact, Lori recognizes that, and so um, I, I've gone around um, giving a presentation on the Yosemite case, and Lori always goes with me, so I'm not alone when I do it. And just recently, I had to testify in a case, and Lori went with me to testify because she knew that the testimony would affect me because it was a case I had worked. And so, yeah, that's kind of what you live with.
Lori's an incredible support system.
She literally is my life. I mean, she's the reason I'm alive.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Yeah, and I understand now, I have a little bit more understanding what you meant too about going into the community, you're experiencing triggers that are just replaying those tapes.
Yeah, one of the frustrating things that I experience is that I cannot predict or foresee the triggers that will set me off. It is something as simple as watching a movie and seeing something in a movie. Um, One of the things I did, I guess, which was a symptom of what I was experiencing, was I guess for 10 years, I went to visit the grave of Michael Lyons, and I went to his funeral. I'd been there. I'd been in contact with his mom. And we were watching a show on TV. I forget the name of it, but I think one of the last episodes of the show, they made it a very emotional episode by having the investigator go to visit the grave of the victim whose case he had helped solve. Well,
Mm.
you sit there and you think that's dramatic and scripted and planned, and then I'll look at Lori and say, we lived this, we lived that. And
Yeah,
it's and sometimes um there's an example. I think it was Clint Eastwood movie. Uh, I think it was called Flags of Our Fathers. And at the very end, they showed one of the combat veterans coming back and meeting with the mother of his close friend who had been abducted by the Japanese and tortured and brutalized. And he went to see the mom, and he deliberately did not tell the mom what had happened to her son to protect her memory and her thoughts. And I mean, there have been times where I've done that. because you don't, you look at the victim parents and you think, God, you don't want them to know or see what you have. And so I try and put it in different terms.
Even if they ask for the information, you'll just say it in a way that is softer to communicate it.
Yeah, well, I think it's in the book with Joey Armstrong. Um, she was beheaded, it's common knowledge.
Yes.
And Lori and I, and we took our oldest son, Joe. I had to testify in the preliminary hearing for Cary Stayner in Mariposa. And when we were there, there was a woman who was being very socially forward, asking everyone who they were, what they were doing there. So we kind of gave her a wide berth. And when we got on the elevator to go to our room, she got on the elevator with us. And it happened to be Leslie Armstrong, who was Joey's mother.
Mhm.
And she, of course, who are you? Why are you here? And when I told her I was Jeff Rinek, she sort of fell to the floor and started crying and saying that the head of the FBI would not tell her what happened to her daughter. Well, I knew in detail. So we told her we would tell her, and we took her to our room, and Lori and Joe left. And the way I put it to her is that her daughter, Joey, fought for her life. And that struggle to live caused her to leave behind all kinds of evidence that helped lead to the identity of Cary Stayner. And because of that, I had the opportunity to be with him and be lucky enough for him to choose me to offer his confession. And so I told her I would tell her everything that happened. But what I said, if Joey were alive and you gave her the option of sacrificing herself so others could live, or saving herself, but others would die, what would she choose? And she said, no, she would definitely sacrifice herself.
Mm.
And I said to her mom, well, that's what happened. That's what she did. Her struggle to live caused her to force him to leave behind evidence that ended up putting me in his presence. And I said, even though people say he confessed to me, you have to always remember that it was your daughter that solved this. And I was simply your daughter's tool. And it was your daughter's struggle for life that caused all this to end. And that's how I put it. And I didn't then think it was necessary to describe, the crime scene itself. I also, when Cary Stayner confessed, I don't know if your viewers know, but Cary Stayner's younger brother was Stephen Stayner, who had been abducted in 1973 and held for 7 years. There's a movie about him called I Think My Name is Stephen, that Hollywood did. And so here I was about to notify the parents that not only did they lose their first son to this, but also their second son is now a serial killer. And so Lori and I stayed up all night the night he confessed to figure out, how do you tell parents what their son has done like this? And so what I ended up saying to them is that the uh, the the light of good in Carrie was brighter than the light of evil because he chose me as his tool to stop himself. And he's the reason that all of this stopped, and I do believe that. And so it helped them get through it, I think, by helping them to remember and to consider that although their son had done terrible, terrible things, there was a part of him that stopped himself.
Can you, and also, can you speak a little bit for people that don't know what the Yosemite murders are? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, sure. In February of 1999, there was a woman named Carol Sun, her daughter Julie, and their friend from Argentina, Silvina Peloso. They first visited the University of Pacific here in Sacramento or in Stockton, and then they went down to tour the Yosemite National Park. And on the 15th, no one ever heard from them again. No one knew where they were. Carol's husband was trying to reach them, couldn't reach them. They had disappeared. It was people, the preliminary searches were started. No one really knew what happened, whether it was, a crime or whether they had had a car accident and needed to be found. But eventually, Carol's son's wallet ended up 60 miles from where they were. And when that happened, it was generally suspected there was a crime. And it became established that Carol and her daughter Julie and their friend were abducted from their hotel room at the I forget the name of the place already. They at the lodge they were staying in, they were abducted, they were gone, and Carol and her daughter weren't found. Or with actually Carol and Sylvina weren't found until March 19th, it was almost a month later. And then a
Right.
week after that, a letter came in and they found Julie. And so now it was established that the three had been abducted and murdered. The location of the bodies was up in Tuolumne County, which is way north of where they were, near a town called Sonora. And so they were working that as the crime, and they had developed two guys as suspects, but nothing concrete was developing from it. There was no real evidence other than what they were saying, which wasn't reliable. And then about in July of 21st, a few months later, a naturalist at Yosemite National Park, Joey Armstrong, disappeared. And again, a few days later, her remains were found. And in this case, unfortunately, she had been beheaded. And that investigation did a really good job identifying an individual coming up from the meadow where she lived. And he turned out to be Cary Stayner. And so Cary Stayner was eventually arrested, but accidentally released. And then there was a big search on for him because they were thinking of him as being responsible for Joey's death. And then I was selected. I was picked with two other guys. He was located at a nudist camp, Laguna del Sol, south of Sacramento. So three of us were sent down there to go pick him up. We didn't know anything about what we were doing or the reason. He ended up riding back with me in my car. And then when we got back to the office, he asked to speak with me alone. And when he did, he let us know that he was responsible for all four murders. And from there, we proceeded to take a statement from him that was 6 hours long and answered all the questions. So he was the guy. He was eventually convicted, and now he's on death row in California.
So as a parent, as a mother, and as a person that enjoys the parks, that story really hit me personally in a way that others didn't. It's absolutely terrifying and horrific. And my understanding, he was a handyman as well.
He was, and I've had a lot of contact with a lot of people that express what you just did. It really affected them because we associate Yosemite with natural beauty and everything that's good about nature and the world. The last thing you think of when you think of Yosemite National Park is, a serial homicide case. But yet it did happen. People should realize it's very rare, and they shouldn't ever change their plans because they think something like that's going to happen. I mean, the
Mhm.
odds are greater you'll have a vehicle accident than something like that happening. And and so Yosemite remains to be beautiful. Everything that was there before is still there now. There's nothing changed other than it's got an event in it that no one wants to believe happened there, but it did. But it's all been resolved, and the answers have been done, and the explanations have been obtained, and it's not something that's unknown or a big suspicion. It's everything is settled.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying too. That gives people more confidence to
Yes.
visit. When I know you and I have talked about this, you have a superpower of of like, being able to be empathic and connect with people. So before he decided to give the confession, my understanding is you had already connected with him. Is that right? Prior to that
Yeah.
a little bit?
Well, the case was being run by the person who was in charge of our office, the special agent in charge. And in my opinion, he didn't have the experience he needed to have to work cases like this. But the case had garnered a lot of national, even international attention because Yosemite is internationally known. And one of the victims came from Argentina, which is another international impact. And so it was a very, very highly publicized case. It was very much in the consciousness of the country. A lot of people knew about it. And so I think I lost track of your question. I'm sorry. You were asking me about,
When you picked him up, from the time that you picked him up till he
thank you.
made that decision, there
Yeah,
okay, yeah,
that's my age. So what I was getting at is that because of all the notoriety, he was in the wind when he was accidentally released from the Mariposa County Jail. And so there was this massive search on for him. And a manager at a nudist colony south of Sacramento, Laguna del Sol, called in to the FBI hotline to say that he was there. And so our SAC dispatched myself and two of my partners, John Bowles and Ken Hitmeyer, down to this place to go pick him up. And that's where we went. And we got down there, and those people were pretty fired up because apparently he was eating breakfast and he was dressed. And the fact that he was dressed had them all unsettled. And
yeah,
so I remember walking, the three of us, and we had two uniformed Sacramento County Sheriff's deputies with us. And I don't know if any of your listeners have been to a nudist colony. The only experience I ever had with a nudist colony was on a shot in the dark with Peter Sellers and Elkie Summer.
right.
I didn't know what to expect, whether I'd see a lot of guys walking around with guitars hanging over them. But eventually, as we started walking through the place, it was quite a shock to the senses. And then when we got to the restaurant, and Cary Stayner was aware that we were at the doorways, he stood up and put his hands over his head, which isn't real normal behavior for people eating in a restaurant. So we approached him, and we had no idea of why we were there for him or what we were supposed to do. We had absolutely no direction other than we were supposed to make contact with them. And once we did make contact with them and we were asking for guidance, they wanted us to try and get him to agree to an interview back at our office in Sacramento, which was a 45-minute drive. I was driving, I like muscle cars. So I had gotten, when I worked for the FBI, I was able to get the used cars off of our surveillance squad, which were like Z28s and Mustangs. And so at the time I was driving a Z28. Oh, I'm sorry. No, I wasn't. At the time I was driving a Ford Thunderbird with an Interceptor engine. It was really nice. And
Nice.
it was a two-door. So I asked Carrie, look, if you agree to be interviewed at our office, I'll give you a ride up there, and then when we're done, I'll bring you back. And he agreed to that. So I ended up driving with him in my car. So he was actually in the passenger seat right next to me as I was driving. And he, because I didn't know who he was or anything about him, we handcuffed him behind his back so he couldn't affect me while I was driving in case he decided he didn't want to go. And then we put his seatbelt on to protect him. And then it was he and me in my car. And then my partner John Bowles came behind us in his car to provide security. So if anything happened, he'd be there.
Okay.
The ride was normally a 45-minute drive, but there was a construction on the highway, which caused it to become a 90-minute drive. And during that time, you know, readers need to, or your listeners need to understand, I didn't know what he had done. I didn't know what he was suspected of doing. I was just picking up this guy. We were both in the same circumstances of being thrown together on a Saturday, doing something that we had no idea,
Right.
what we were doing. That weekend, Lori and I, well, I should say Lori had planned a romantic weekend because our sons were visiting their grandparents on the East Coast, and we were alone, and we were going to go for dinner, and I'm sure every husband knows the pressure that's on when there's a romantic dinner that's planned.
Definitely.
I had intended, I love working on cars, so I had a Jeep I was restoring, and I was planning on painting it. And I was thinking, oh, I could paint the Jeep that weekend. Little did I know that was never going to happen. And so I ended up, so here we are, two guys thrown together on this 90-minute trip, and we're just talking, um and I was very interested in his brother because that was the work I did, and I wanted to know how his family considered law enforcement was with them, because it would help me to understand what I could do better in my job. And so we he agreed. He said I could ask him about his brother. But before any of that happened, while we're driving back, we're just, kind of talking to each other, getting to know each other, just like you and I are talking now, getting to know each other. Same thing.
Same
There
thing.
was no prejudice, there was no element of suspicion or concern. And the reality was, I really didn't have any role in this other than to drop him off back at our office. And my goal was to get home as quickly as I could to Lori. And so we had a nice talk. He said he liked camping and he loved the solitude of Yosemite. And he just, he was pretty smart. I mean, he was well versed in things, probably better than me. Uh, One thing that was remarkable, I'm sure, I presume your listeners might be too young to know, but there was a movie out in the 70s called Billy Jack, and it was with a guy named Tom Laughlin and his wife, Dolores. I forget her last name. And I had seen Billy Jack when I was in college, and it was kind of like this sleeper cult movie because Billy Jack was this part American Indian who had become a martial artist in Vietnam. And when he came back to his town that was being run by all these corrupt guys. And his martial arts, he used his martial arts to make it an even playing field between the people being oppressed, and which who were his friends, and the corrupt guys. And everybody just loved that idea. I love the idea. And it was I think it was one of the first real martial arts movies. I was obsessed with Billy Jack. He wore this black hat and a black t-shirt and jeans. Yeah, yeah, I hate to admit it, but I mean, I was wearing my black t-shirt and jeans.
I'm gonna check out
And
that movie.
but Cary Stayner looked exactly like Tom Laughlin. And
Uh-huh.
I asked him in the car, I said, "Did you ever see Billy Jack?" He goes, "Nah, never saw Billy Jack." But for some reason, I just kept asking him, "Did you ever see Billy Jack? Did you ever see Billy Jack?" I said, "You look just like Billy Jack. You could be Billy Jack." And so we're driving, and then we talked about his brother, and apparently Stephen, um, the people who abducted Stephen, um, and held him for 7 years. They got 7 years in prison for kidnapping him, holding him, sexually assaulting him for 7 years. They abducted and assaulted another young boy, Timothy White, that Stephen walked out with. And Carrie said that um, when Stephen got home, it wasn't happily ever after. He had they were a strict Mormon family, and
Mhm.
when Stephen came home, he was not living according to the tenets of their religion, and he was difficult, and he was, kind of corrupting the other kids to do things that they weren't supposed to do. He was living a life of recklessness. And sure enough, when he was 22 years old, he was riding a motorcycle and he contributed to an accident where he was killed. And the person who we had the accident with fled the scene of the accident and fled to Mexico. They ended up bringing him back, and then they charged him with a misdemeanor. So he didn't even get jail time. And just Cary and I presume his family thought that was really, unfair. And I agreed with them. I agreed. But
Mhm.
I was also, very interested, what could law enforcement have done to help your family, to help get them through this? What can I do if I'm dealing with these things? And he, he just said it was just something that never really happened for the family. No one ever really seemed to care about the family other than the use they had for making these shows that they did. I, because of the work I was doing, I had established some contacts with people that did do work with victim families, and I offered him to help get these people on board with his family if they wanted, if he wanted. So we talked about that a little bit. And then, eventually we got back to Sacramento, and at that time, it was the FBI had installed these impound gates, these very heavy impound gates. So I had to go into our impound, into our lot, secure lot.
Right.
And so as I put my card read to be read, and as the gate is slowly being rolled back, Cary looks at me and recites verbatim the most famous lines from Billy Jack. So he had seen it,
Mm.
and I
You
looked at
had
him.
seen it. Yeah,
He
right.
started laughing. I started laughing. It was funny. And so I think, it's probably not the thing people want to hear, but we were friends from the drive. We got to know each other, and we brought him in. Now at this time, I didn't know he had done anything. We were told he was a witness, possibly an old boyfriend, who was running in fear. So we had no idea he could have been the suspect. So when we get back to the FBI office, I park him in a room outside of the security area of the office, an interview room, and just told him to wait there while I figured out what we were supposed to do. And uh, nobody knew what I was supposed to do. The SAC was there, and he eventually told me to go in and interview him. Well, I knew nothing about what had happened in the case. I knew nothing about what led them to him or what was going on. So John Bowles, my partner, and I decided that we would interview him for biographical information, and then we would call in the office polygrapher to polygraph him because then he could come up with the questions that needed to be asked.
Right.
Ken Hitmeyer, who was my partner and best friend, was the supervisor there at the time because all the supervisors were gone. And so he was running everything. And, it was because of him that we all got set up so well. And then, so we were basically doing biographical information and stalling him for the polygrapher. I had gone to our night security desk and ordered a pizza for us all because we hadn't eaten yet. Neither had he. We took him from his breakfast. So we were in the room, the mug room, taking his pictures and stuff. Not official ones, although they ended up being used in a lot of this stuff. Just like modeling pictures, just to stall him. And
Okay.
then John Bowles comes in and says, "Hey, the polygrapher's here and the pizza's here. What do you want to do first?" And he looked at me and said, "Well, let's forget the polygraph. I want to talk to Jeff alone." And everybody kind of rolls their eyes because with me, that seems to be a common thing. A lot of times I'm talking to people for one thing, and the next thing I know, they want to talk to me alone, and then they're going to reveal something. And the thing with me is, I'm like the Barbara Walters of the FBI. It's like
Yeah.
I don't go in to interview these guys. I go in to give them therapy. But at the heart of that is I do care. I mean, for instance, from all the experience I've had and all the things I've worked, I realized that, most of these men that commit these crimes are themselves victims. And if you look at the age at which they were victimized, you can tell what age of preferred victim they have. And it has never, ever failed me, that little theory of mine that I'm embarrassed to, tell other people. And in this case, Cary wanted to see me alone. And when I got in there, he started saying, I'm a terrible person. I've done terrible things. He started sounding as if he might be the suspect, which was a surprise to me. And I said, Cary, good people do bad things all the time. It doesn't mean they're bad people. It just means we got to work out why the bad thing happened. And he proceeds to not tell me, but indicate strongly that he can help us with Joey Armstrong's case. And I'm taking that to mean maybe he is the guy. And so we basically talk about that for a while, and then he says to me he's willing to. Oh, he also pointed out that he knew about San Peloso, which was the first three that happened the previous February. And I said, there's a lot of guys that claim that crown, but I'm not sure. And at this point, I went out to see Hitman, who was the acting supervisor, and Hitman decided that we were going to move the interview to our polygraph room where it could be video and audio taped, and we would move everything there, which was a great choice. I went back into him, and he's telling me, he says that he's willing to talk about these things. He's willing to answer all this stuff. I was talking to him in the car about the idea of closure as finding out what happened and not being able to live with it as much as being able to see what happened and or understand it, or at least get some solace from having the knowledge of what went on. And he said, he could give closure on these cases, but he wanted something first. And I was like, well, what do you want? And he goes, well, I know I want to see pictures of little girls. And I said, you mean child pornography? And he wouldn't use that word. And he started going back and forth with me over that he knew, because we're the FBI, we would have pictures and videos, sexual pictures and videos of little girls in our evidence, and he wanted to see it. And if we let him see it, then he would give us anything we wanted. And I told him I didn't have the authority to make that kind of decision, but I would pass his request on up. And his one request at that point was to see the evidence of little girls, the pornographic evidence of little girls. So then, based on Hitman, we all moved up to the polygraph room. And when we sort of got settled there, John Bowles brought the pizza up. And when he brought the pizza into us, I offered for him to stay in. John and I were close. We were partners too. I really cared about him, and I felt better with him, and he worked well with me, and so he agreed to stay. And so he was in the interview with me. It was the two of us that did this together, and so he starts eating the pizza, and then says, this is going to be my last meal as a free man. I said, well, I don't know that you can jump to that conclusion. And then as he's thinking, he goes, I want some other things besides what I asked for. And then he knew there was a large reward being offered for information by the victim family. And he wanted that reward money to go to his family. And he also knew they were building a new federal prison near where his family lived, and he wanted to be housed in that prison. And this is one of the few times I got a little upset with him. I said, look, you asked for one thing. Now you're adding two more things. I said, they're not going to accept it from us. And they're certainly not going to accept it from you. So you need to, what's the one thing? You pick the one thing. I'll go to bat for you for one thing and one thing only. What's the one thing that you want us to fight for? What do you think he said?
He wanted to see the evidence,
Yes.
the child porn.
He wanted to see the child porn. Here's a guy who's willing to sacrifice his life to see child pornography. And anybody out there who's wondering, some people think that child pornography is a victimless crime. It's not a victimless crime because these guys, their goal is to do it in life, is to have the material action that, and people don't realize that eventually these guys will find a way or seek to find a way to have physical contact with the children.
They'll
Nevertheless,
fantasize. You're saying they'll fantasize until they can manifest it in real life.
absolutely. Nevertheless, we agree that because we don't know what's going to be authorized, since he had made so many incriminating statements about himself regarding Joey Armstrong's case, he said he would provide us with a statement about that. And then after that, we would see what the decision was. So we went through and we talked about Joey Armstrong's case, after which, and we were done, I was advised that there was going to be no viewing of child pornography. And I explained to him that even though the world would see us as coercing him by giving him this, in reality, we knew it'd be him coercing us. And we weren't willing to break a crime to solve a crime. So I spent a little time explaining to him what I thought it meant, what I thought his options were. One of the things I had promised him that he did not ask for, but I know he cared a lot about, was that someone had to go prepare his family for what was going to happen because it was going to be in the news. And we didn't want his family to learn this on the news. So I said, when you're making your choice and your decision, you've got to remember that, the later I am getting down to your family, the more likely it is they're going to learn it on the news. So, make your choice. So he waited. There was like several seconds of silence, after which he broke the silence and said, "Okay, let's do it." And then we ran through the events of the first case with Carol and the girls.
Is there generally when he's telling you the details, is he emotional, unemotional? I've read research that psychopaths are unemotional during a confession. I don't know if that applies to all, or if even you would consider him a psychopath, but what are your insights into that?
That's a great question, and thank you for asking that because I like to address this. There's a lot of people that judge me because I don't judge him. And the reality is that there's a book out called Without Conscience. It's written by Dr. Robert Hare. And his premise, or what he describes in his book, is that people who are psychopaths are people who are completely devoid of feeling emotion. In other words, just like some people are born without an arm, some people are born without emotion. I think he's absolutely correct, and I believe in that. But I do not believe Cary Stayner is a psychopath. And the reason I don't believe that is because he was very unemotional in his discussion with us, except for one point, one big point. He believes that Julie Sund fell in love with him and he fell in love with her. He interpreted her cooperation with his demands to be an act of emotion of love. And because she felt that way and expressed that, he felt that way to her. And so when he talked about Julie, he cried and he emoted quite a bit. He even emoted at times when he talked about Joey Armstrong and how he killed her. But my opinion of Cary Stayner is that he grew up in a family that he perceived did not have enough, um, what's the word I'm searching for? Intimacy. He did not, his family, his mom and dad, I liked them very much, but they were they worked I learned later that they work to control their emotions and not display their emotions. And I think what Cary was searching for in his crimes was intimacy. And I believe that because he was holding every victim when they died. And I've learned myself through, and I believe that two of the most intimate times in life is, of course, when you're with your partner and expressing your intimacy.
Mhm.
And, but also, I know I held both my parents when they took their last breath, and that's also an emotional moment. And the fact that Carrie held all of his victims when they took their last breath, I think he was searching for intimacy, but that's my opinion and my opinion only. I don't, he has elements that could cause people to think he's a psychopath, and I don't deny that, he expresses them. But on the other hand, his hunger for intimacy was something I believe is a reality with him, and I think the intimacy he sought was the intimacy he found with me the day we were together.
Being able to talk so openly about what you
Yes,
did.
right.
When you are in a confession, can you tell if someone is lying, or is there a way to tell?
Well, there's always the possibility that someone is lying. In my opinion, uh, I don't consider a confession as an event unto itself. Um, I guess I guess a good way to explain it would be I had an interview with a young man who killed another young man, and my I don't start when you see TV or whatever, people start out with a complete discussion of the event that happened that was the crime. I don't do that. I like to get to know people. I want to know who they are. I'm willing to share myself if they're willing to share themselves. So I was in an interview with a young man one time, and I want to know about his background because I believe that people that are victimized will go on to victimize others, and so I wanted to know whether he had been victimized, and I said to him, if you could have anything in your life, what would it be? And he looked at me and he said, if I could have anything in my life, I would want to be loved and I would want someone to love. Now, that to me doesn't sound like and then as we proceeded to talk further, he goes and he gives me this discussion of how he killed this young man. And when I do my interviews, when you ask about false confessions,
Yes.
when I do my interviews and someone is confessing to me, I try and be as thorough as I can, and I come at them from different things. For instance, like in Carrie's case, what happens is the first thing is I ask the person I'm talking to give me kind of a brief outline description of what they did. And then once they go through that in their own words, I take that and use that as my guide. And then we go back again. And this time, okay, Carrie, I want you to describe what did you see? What did you smell? What did you feel? What did you do? And then we'll go through that, which takes quite a while. Then we'll come back, and one of the things that always rides with me is that your offender, the killer, is the last person to see your victim alive. They're the last contact you have with that person. And that means a lot to me. And so I want to know how the victim was when this happened. Tell me what she said. Tell me what she did. Tell me what, and we run through the crime as he perceives it from the eyes and feelings of the victim. And then when we get done with that way, I want him to take me there and tell me what happened. So I'm standing in the room, metaphorically, and he's telling me what I would see. And then when we're all done with all of that, I ask them to write a letter of apology to the victim. And between all those things, I try as hard as I can. If there's going to be a problem with the confession, it should come out. And quite frankly, I've never I've always been very fortunate. I've never gotten a false confession. I've experienced a false confession, But also, once you determine that it's false, a lot of investigators, um, they want to believe it because it's the end of the case. It's the end of what they're having to go through. People don't realize that when you're going through one of these cases, it's intense for the investigator. They've got so many things. They've got the public pressure on them. They've got their own pressure on themselves from their department. And even more so, they have the pressure of wanting to make it right for the victim. So there's a lot riding on the investigator, and some investigators just want to take, the way out that will seems the best. Now, there's an interview technique called the read technique, and the read technique has been used since the 60s or 50s. It's the interview technique they teach with polygraphers, and I believe that the interview technique is very um, burdensome. It's overburdensome. I believe it puts a burden on the offender. And I think anytime you put a burden on the offender such that they want to do anything they can to get out of that burden, that's where I think you're likely to get a false confession. And the New York, the five are an example of that.
Two things. I thought the techniques that you use to get the details of the crime from the killer, that's actually the same techniques as a therapist. If we're working with a first responder that has witnessed or experienced a horrific event, maybe an EMT that has to pull bodies out of a fire, those are the same techniques that we use. Exactly the
Oh,
same.
I didn't know that.
What did you smell? What did you taste? Describe to me this, describe to me that. And
Yeah.
secondly, the false confession, I've been trying to understand the read method a little bit more. Is it also like leading? So the person, like you said, the burden is on the person being interviewed. Is it like also leading them into a story, or can you help me understand the read technique a little more?
I, I'm not an authority on the read technique, and I certainly wouldn't accept myself as really understanding it or knowing it.
Yeah.
The way in my mind, and I'm not a professional at this, but the way I see the read technique is that it works very hard to reduce the value of the person you're interviewing with the promise of giving that value back if they do what you want them to do.
Got it.
And that's the way I look at it. And I think that's why we get false confessions.
The value is give me what I want to hear and you can leave and you have your freedom.
That's one way of doing it, but there's also other ways. It's, for instance, look, I'm giving you an example of that.
Sure, it's
Okay,
just
it's
example.
like, look, you're a good person. I know you're a good person. You don't want this ripping you down. You don't want this to keep you in the basement and to keep you from being who you can be. Once we deal with this and once you tell me what's happened, then we can recover this and you can fly again. Does that, so what I believe they're doing is they're assaulting the value of the person they're talking to and promising that they can give that value back if they do what the person is expecting them to do. That's the way I see it. I don't,
Right.
that's just my personal opinion.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that sounds very different than what you do. I was reading in the book sort of how your I think the line, sorry if I'm trying to, I think you said you open your heart and soul, not just to the victim, but you're actually stepping in to that place with the actual person that you're obtaining the confession from, or the killer. Is that
That's
right?
correct.
And you're trying to connect with their goodness?
The big joke about me in the FBI when I worked there was that when I'd come out of a statement like this, I would be crying along with the offender because I believe certain things. I believe that if you give a gift to someone, they're going to want to give it back. And in this case, a gift is information about yourself. I think if you go into talk to someone and you're absolutely willing to tell them anything they want to know about you because you're asking them anything you want to know about them, the least you could do is match that. And I think sometimes when you share something about yourself, people are going to naturally come back and want to share something about themselves. I think people are naturally good and they don't want to receive anything that they can't offer back.
That's amazing that you just shared that, because even in the community as a trauma therapist, there are some therapists that believe you should not share anything with your client. There's a wall up between therapist and client, and other therapists like me, I don't like that approach. I think, when you're being vulnerable with the person you're working with, you're creating a safe space for them to be vulnerable back.
Yeah, I agree. And how can you expect someone to want to interact with you if you're not willing to interact with them? It's not a one-way street. And I've been judged just like you've been, it sounds like you've been judged. People have
Absolutely.
certain feelings about me. But at the same time, this is one thing I didn't realize what was happening, and I should have, but I sort of, when we would get new guys in the office and they would come and seek me out and tell me how they did their interview, and it was like the way I did mine, I, it was wonderful. I mean, it was really nice to hear, but I think a lot of people started, doing what I did and finding that it was successful, and they'd be very excited. There's one guy in particular that I did this with. We were working a homicide, and um, the agent I was working with was with the killer the whole day. We didn't know the killer was a killer, and then we found out that the witness was in fact the killer. The management said, "Oh well, if he's the killer, well, we got to send Rinek in to interview him because Reinek's going to do the interview." And I think that's a terrible thing because you have the agent who spent the whole day,
Hmm.
developing this relationship. And so the way I agreed to do it is that he would go in and do the interview, and I would sit outside and be available for any questions or guidance or anything he wanted. And he was successful. He got a perfect confession. We were able to understand what happened and why it happened. And that was the last interview like that person did, because it was just something that wasn't in his being. I mean, he did it that time, and he
Mhm.
was very, very good, and he could have been really good, but he just did not want to experience that depth of human depravity again.
So I want to go back for just a second, if you don't mind, because you
No.
said so many interesting things. I just didn't want to when you were going back to Cary Stayner and saying that the victimizers were once victims, is there a certain pattern, like, is it sexual abuse, physical abuse? Is there any type of trauma pattern that you particularly saw that was sort of the formula to create someone who would later become a sexual sadist?
My personal opinion is that when a child is a victim, that and a lot of these children that are victims, their clock of maturity stops. When you hear about a 30-year-old guy that hangs out and plays with 9-year-old kids and is having a great time, that's an example of what I mean. There was a case that I worked that occurred in the year 2000 of a 9-year-old girl that was abducted and murdered. And the killers was actually a father and a son. There's a book that was written about it called um, uh, "Like Father." Lori's helped me. Thank you. "Like Father, Like Son," and it involves two men named Thomas Soria Sr. and Thomas Soria Jr. And in this case, Thomas Soria Jr. had been assaulted by his father from an extremely early age. And here's an 18-year-old boy who's hanging out and playing with 9-year-old kids in a parking lot, and then ends up bringing one of the girls up to his father, who proceeds to assault and kill her. So I do believe that children that are assaulted as children, their clock stops in maturity in certain ways. And I believe also that when they get of age or they're adult and they're thinking of what they want in life, they stay at that 9-year-old. I'm just using that as an example, but
Sure.
their preferred victim is a 9-year-old child because that's when it happened to them. In Cary Stayner's case, when he was, before was confessing, but he was telling me why he was going to start confessing to me. He was telling me that, he was, that he felt very comfortable with me. And one of the things he said, Jeff, I've never said this to anybody ever, but my uncle molested me. And it turned out that when Cary was around 12 years old, that's when his uncle molested him. Now, if you look at the ages of Sylvina and Julie, they were around that age too.
Yeah.
So I just have this little personal theory that if you look at the age that your offender's been assaulted, you'll know the age of his preferred victim.
Is that how you were able to draw empathy when you were going into a confession? Is sort of like realizing that a lot of these men had been victims in the
I
sense?
think I think from your questions, you just helped me realize something. Um, I think one of the reasons that I start out talking to people about their lives is because invariably I'll find something about their life that I can relate to in my life.
Mm,
And I think being able to relate to each other is a big thing. And I enjoy that too. I enjoy meeting people who do the same things I do or have had similar experiences. So when you talk about how to get them talking about or whatever, it's not really talking about that part of their life. What happens is we'll talk about the parts of our lives that we're focusing on that we have in common, and then slowly adjust that to, okay, so how does this come into it? And then we start talking about that. And then once we start talking about the offenses, then that's where it stays. We always, because that's what's for. There's kind of a funny story I'll share with you. I'm a DIYer, I like doing everything myself. And Lori and we had a deck on our house that had fallen down. And before we built our new deck, I wanted to fill in a big spot in front of the house for erosion control. And so I was having stone delivered. And so the way our house is situated, Lori standing in the living room, she can see the trucks pull up and drop off the stone. Well, there's one guy pulls up and drops off stone, and then she describes to me she's inside and she sees me out there talking to the guy for like 45 minutes. And then he's sort of, when he leaves, we do this big bear hug with each other, and he drives away, and I get inside and Lori was like, what was that about? Well, it turned out in talking to the guy, I mean, just like with a delivery guy, just talking to him, just getting to know him, turns out he is a convicted child molester, and he had done his time. And he felt so comfortable with me, he was talking all about it.
just
And
getting information.
I told him, all the things we've talked about here. I said, and the one thing he said to me that really convinced me he was a caring person is because he said, I know I can never be around children. And I said, if you know that and you live by that rule, I can't tell you how much respect I have for you, because I don't believe there's anything that anyone can do for you to make that go away. And the fact that you're willing to face it and fight it and live with it and deal with it, that just says you're a good person. And so when he left, he was crying and hugged and subsequently he came back. It's funny because we had to have some more stone delivered, and this was just like a few months ago. He came back, and I needed him to dump the stone in like on this target, and he
Yeah.
just like he took so much time. It was perfect. He dumped it exactly where it was supposed to be. He took so much time, and it was kind of like his way of honoring me. It was really nice. So
Yeah.
I do believe that, and I care about people. Um, unrelated to sexual assault. Well, I was working in case. Well, I was working a case of a missing girl one time, and it turned out that the offender was using a cab, but nobody would go talk to the cab owner or the cab company owner because he was a convicted bank robber. So I went to see him. I said, "Hey, I know I don't really care about that. This is what's happened, and I need to help. Maybe we can do this together." And because of that, I mean, we ended up. He gave me his records, his books, everything I wanted. He gave me to look at, and it was just a good experience. And here's a guy who did something. He did his time. It's a mistake in his life. He's living life now the way he's expected to and should be. So how can you not converse with a person or accept them? And so that was my philosophy. But because no one else would talk to him or have anything to do with him, he would only talk to me, and which was to me an honor. I mean, that's the way I am. I don't I don't think there's certain people in my life that I'll never forgive them for things they've done, and they're not. And I know my wife is laughing right now is because she knows exactly one person I'm talking about.
Right.
But um but for the most part, I do think people at heart are good. Or I mean, there are, but I do believe that I have no effect on psychopaths.
Have you met a few in your
Oh
current?
yeah. Well, here's an example.
Yeah.
I'm Jewish, and so every time it was the Christmas season, I always stayed and worked. I always worked, and we had a call come in like 2 days before Christmas one year. There was a guy at a local police station who had killed, I think, a bunch of people at a warehouse that he worked at. And he said he would only speak to an FBI agent. He wouldn't speak to the local law enforcement. It wasn't an FBI case, but they were asking for help. So I went over and I talked to him. And all the things we've talked about here, I'm talking to him, and he's convinced that aliens exist in life as people, and the people he killed were really aliens, and he really believed it. And how can you argue with that? I mean, how can you convince a guy like that who's actually he walked around with a 45 strapped on his chest for 6 months before he used it? And I mean, that is frightening when you think about it. And then when he did use it, he was convinced that he didn't kill a human being, and so nothing should happen to him. And so when I asked him to write a letter of apology, he's like, "No, I'm not writing a letter of apology. I did what I had to do, and it's done." Now that guy really believes it. How can you contest that? So that's the kind of interview that I have no good with, you
Yeah,
know.
right. Yeah, yeah, right. It's
And yeah,
psychotic.
I mean, there's some people that can go out, at 10 o'clock and commit a brutal, gruesome crime and then quit in time to go for lunch. How I'm not able to talk to people like that. I just look at them like they're lost causes.
Yeah, I get you. You're almost the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. It's that you can't connect to because there's nothing
No,
to
you
pull
can't.
from.
Right. I try to connect with people on the same terms I live on. You know, I think when people realize, I think what I don't think I'm different. I think everybody can do what I'm doing. I'm not hesitant to share with people things that we might have in common. And I think once you find a point of commonality, you build off that, and that's how it works.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, when I first met you, I told you my dream was to be an FBI agent. And immediately, you connected with me on that. So,
Yeah, and hopefully I've helped you realize that you don't do that anymore.
yeah, you've definitely given me a lot of insight.
Yeah.
So when, I wanted to also kind of like circle back around to the PTSD.
Okay.
And so now that I think everyone listening to has a really deeper understanding that you have these videos in your mind of horrific details of what has happened to people. And how, when you're when you're getting triggered and you're getting that tape playing, can you actually feel changes in your body, like your heart is racing or your sweatiness, or you actually, yeah, you're feeling
I
it.
feel it. I'll give you an example of how it works here. Yeah, if you read the book, there's a chapter in the book called Alexia.
Mhm.
And
Yes.
in that chapter, I talked about how I deliberately caused an emotional breakdown with Alexia's sister to find out what happened to Alexia. And I'm sure, your listeners, I mean, I have a heart. I mean, I'll never forget it because I remember her breaking down. I remember that my desire, my need to find out to what happened to this little girl was stronger than my concern for her emotional welfare. I felt like her life was more important than someone's emotion. And so um, I've always felt, and as I'm telling you this, it's in my mind now, it's going.
Okay.
As I'm telling you this, I can see, and what I did to cause it was to simply have her recall her relationship with her sister and how she took care of her and how she loved her and how her sister loved her and needed her and all and because of it, she gave us every detail that was required and needed to prosecute the parents, and they're still in prison. But after it happened, I looked for her for 20 years because I wanted to apologize for what I had done. It had ridden with me. I'd never forgotten it. I mean, I talked to Lori about it. um, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, the day before my birthday, I get a message on that messenger app. It's from her.
Okay.
And she had every time her mother or stepfather were coming up for parole, she would research on the internet her sister to try and find new information to use against them to prevent them from getting out on parole. And um, the book was released in 2018. And so here she is, a few years later, she sees the book and she reads the chapter and she realizes that's her sister. And she realizes I'm talking about my interview with her. And so she reached out and she contacted and said how much it meant to her to know that there was someplace else on earth that knew her sister had existed because her parents had destroyed every organic remnant of her sister.
Yes.
And then we were in contact with her. And one of the things that I do look is, I'm in contact with a lot of the kids in the cases I've worked, and if they get me, they get Lori. So it's Lori and I as a partnership. That's where Lori is my partner, and so Lori and I have been in her life, and she came out here a couple of years ago, and her friend here prepared me and Lori and said, look, she's not very emotional. She doesn't hug. She doesn't do this. She doesn't do that, just, and so we went down to meet her. And when we walked in, she got up and gave us both hugs. And it was very emotional. It was very hard. I mean, and so it's gotten to the point with her. I said to her when we were talking, I said to her, look, her biggest fear in life was that her mother or stepfather would get out on parole.
Right.
And I told her that for the rest of my life, I will attend those parole sessions with her. And I started doing that a couple of years ago. And apparently I didn't know it because she wrote a book. In fact, hang on, let me get the book. Can you see this book at all?
Yes.
That's her book. She wrote,
It's a little fuzzy to read the title.
it's called I'm Not Broken, Surviving the House of Horrors by Jessica Rial.
I see it better now. Perfect. Yes.
And so um, I I couldn't read it. And See, like now I can tell I'm losing myself. So I had to go give a presentation on the Yosemite case out in Wisconsin. Lori and I went, and on the way back, I fell asleep. When I woke up, Lori was crying from reading the book.
Oh, yeah.
It turned out, Lori was reading what she wrote about me, but and what I didn't know, what Lori didn't know, is that when I went to help, the first time I went with her to the parole thing, it was virtual. Um, her mother was slated to get out. Her
Right.
mother was going to be released on parole, and she felt like there was nothing she could do. And so when it was my turn to talk, I didn't know that she was you know, I I wanted these people. I said to the parole board, I said, "There's no one here that was at the crime scene but me, and I want to tell you what the crime scene was like." And I gave them a blow by blow description of what that crime scene was like.
Yeah.
And when I got done, they denied her parole. And I've since had another parole thing with her. And it's kind of funny because her attorney, when I show up on the parole thing, the attorney goes ballistic and doesn't want me to talk
I
or
bet.
say anything. There was one time where I attended the parole thing and I said, let's discuss the human senses and how they would have uh, um, perceived the crime scene, things like that. So in her book, she wrote that I was a miracle. I just care, and I feel like I have to honor the way they feel about me.
Mhm.
I feel like it's something that has to be earned every time you're in contact with them. And when I spoke at one of the parole things, I said, these women, this her mother and stepfather, what they did, I said, and here's Jessica. If Jessica needs parents, my wife and I will be her parents, and because she's great, she's remarkable what she's done in her life. I recommend you read the book because she's probably one of the best examples of a victim coming around that I've ever seen, and so she sort of considers Lori and I like parents now, and that's just something that when you think about it, it means a lot. And every time I talk to her or write her, I feel like, it's something that you have to always earn every day. It's something that doesn't renew. Every time you do it, you have to earn it.
Right. Yeah. I did take your recommendation to read Jessica's book, and
Oh,
it was, yeah, it hit me on the heart too. I understood Lori crying because I felt emotional during it. For all my listeners, I hope they buy that book. And I'd love to have Jessica on this podcast as well.
I could get her for you, I think, if you'd
Yeah,
like her too.
I
I'll
would
put you
love
in touch
that
with
too.
her. All
But
right.
I appreciate you sharing that because I can see how deeply you care. You really do care.
Well, and there was one time I testified and the defense was going after me. And they asked me how many cases I had worked. And I think I said like, I don't know, somewhere under 50. And they started going after me like, oh my God, all those years and just under 50 and whatever. And it hit me while I was sitting on the stand and I corrected myself to the court. I said 50 where the victims were alive. I've had several hundred where they've been dead. I wasn't used to dealing with live victims. And the realization of that was painful.
Yeah.
So, um, yeah. Anyway,
Yeah. There's a passage in your book that really hit me too. It was retirement has not erased the pain of all this accumulated grief. Neither has medication or therapy or the brotherhood and sisterhood of FBI agents and other law enforcement officers with whom I have shared so many grim tasks.
the day that I talked to her, or that I think it was the day she wrote me. Um,
I stayed in bed all day with Lori crying.
It meant that much. Yeah.
So anyway,
Yeah. But I appreciate you showing, expressing and showing this vulnerability, because this was the point I wanted to do the podcast with you, right, Jeff? Because I remember, for anyone who's listening, I had shared with Jeff that my father was a patrol officer and a detective, and he had seen some some things in his career that affected him very deeply. I remember I shared with you, and sometimes he would come home and he wouldn't talk for days, and I couldn't understand it. And now I know it's because he had witnessed and experienced things that were so difficult and so overwhelming that it overpowered him at some points. Um, and this is why it really meant a lot for me to have this conversation with you. And I
well,
wanted
thank
people
you.
to see, thank you, to see how investigators like yourself impact the trauma that happens to you as an investigator involved in these cases. So thank
Well,
you.
one of the frustrations I've had in the job is that people treat me like I'm unique. I'm not unique. There's most investigators are like me. It's just that they don't express it outside of their comfort zone. I express it as an honor to my family because, and Lori and I talk about this, I am not sure what after effects this has had with my sons and their relationship with me. And I worry about it. And I'll never be able to take back the years that, and what I put Lori through.
Yeah.
Um, so w- that book that was actually a letter to my sons written at the request of Lori. And when I gave her the manuscript to read, um, she was the one who thought it might help others to make it public. And
Mm,
that's how we agreed to publish it. And quite frankly, Melissa, I didn't want the attention. In fact, um, I had a newspaper journalist teach me how to do book queries where you send it out to different literary agents. And I sent it out to a bunch of literary agents and I got 13 responses. And I got one of them was like wanted me to just work with them. And I told the journalist about it, and she said, "Oh my God, like getting one is like winning the lottery." And so I told Lori there was no interest because I didn't want to do it. And then the literary agent that actually caused the book to be written, she actually found me at home, and I had to come clean. I don't like the attention, but I did promise Lori, and I feel like I'm honoring her and my sons by being really open about what I put them through.
yeah, yeah. Well, and
And
you have been. It's an amazing gift.
well, yeah. Lori says I suffered a successful career. It's best described that way.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing all of this, Jeff.
Oh, thank you. You're a wonderful interviewer.
Oh, thank you. Um, is there anything else that you want to share or say?
No, I just think that people should realize it at heart. I think most people are good, and good people do bad things. It doesn't mean we should see them as bad people.
Yeah, very nice. Thank you. Well, thank you for your time, and thank you
Thank you.
for an amazing conversation. I consider you a friend. We've become friends through this process, and
Yes.
this interview really meant a lot to do with
Well,
you.
feel free to stay in touch.
I will. Thank you.
All righty.